Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Equity at Work with Associated Black Charities. My name is Chrissy Thornton. I'm going to invite our guest panelists on to the camera at this time. We're so excited to have all of you with us this afternoon for Equity at Work. It is a monthly webinar series that we do in order to have the tough but very needed conversations about how structural racism continues to impact the lives of Black people, Black families, Black communities, and Black professionals. And so today we are here to talk about anti-racism at work and how to move from awareness to accountability. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Equity at Work is a lauded platform where we can have this discussion, where we can learn from each other's expertise and lived experiences. So welcome. Today, we're talking about how many organizations have issued bold statements, specifically after George Floyd in 2020, on equity, on DEI, and they pledged to become more inclusive, even anti-racist. But as we all know, talk without transformation and real work can create, and has in many cases created, more harm. Racism in the workplace is often subtle. It is systemic and deeply embedded in institutional culture. It has taken generations to build, and it will take a while to dismantle. The first step in doing so is a willingness to communicate and talk about it. It exists, of course, in hiring and in promotions, in who gets mentored and who gets funded, in whose ideas matter, and in how conflict is handled. Today, I am excited to have with me both Wayman Scott and Adar Ayera, and I'm going to invite each of them to take a turn to tell us a little bit about themselves, their background, and why they believe today's conversation is so important. Let's start with you, Wayman, and then we'll move to Adar.
I'm Wayman. I'm Associate Director for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for Gilchrist and GBMC Health Partners. I've been in the equity space for probably off and on the past 30 years. And right now I work in healthcare, and I'm focused heavily on health equity, addressing barriers to access to care in Baltimore City, but we have to build trust, right? So I live in Baltimore where institutions have a long history of exploiting Black people in medicine. So when we talk about building trust, I want to address deep mistrust towards healthcare, and the mistrust it's there for a reason. So we're reaching out to enroll people to give people access, but if the community is not represented among the staff, among the techs, the RNs, the medical providers, the executives, then are we really building trust? So it also ties into workforce equity. And I see there's an urgency in this in two ways. So we see a lot of progress has been made, or some progress has been made, but the progress that has been made is at risk of being dismantled. And there's a big difference between quietly ending an anti-racism or an inclusive program and actively undoing the gains that were created. So I'll give an example. Uh, it's one thing for an organization to stop expanding their supplier diversity program, but it's another to cancel the contracts with Black-owned businesses and suppliers. So those kind of rollbacks, that erases efforts that are hard won. And then on the health equity side, cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, dismantling safety nets in Black and Brown communities to access healthcare. So it's almost like there's a risk for stifling the work that has been made. So
Yeah,
that's a
it's
big
been,
part of the
I would
urgency for
say,
me.
a rough 7 months for many
Yes, indeed.
communities, and certainly not new harm to the Black community, but it has been perpetuated. And Adar, so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I need to give a shout out to a colleague and friend, Bernard Sims. I am so very appreciative of the invitation. So I'm Adar Ayera. I am an organizational development specialist. The analysis that I use in working with organizations regarding how they can become more inclusive is anti-racism, anti-oppression. And I say this very intentionally because oftentimes we tend to conflate terms, DEI, anti-racism, anti-oppression, equity. Those things are not the same. Inclusion, those things are not the same. And anti-racism, anti-oppression is a very distinct analysis. DEI is a framework, and there are 6 to 7 different ways in which that framework is operated. It is not the same. So I want to be very intentional and clear about this coming in so that we all know where we are in our discussion. Why is this moment urgent? You know, it's not just this moment, right? Because what we're seeing right now is an outcome.
Mhm.
It is an outcome of decades of moments where we have seen a regression to the status quo, the pre-1964 status quo of the United States of America. And actually, this is why our understanding of anti-racism, anti-oppression as an analysis is so very important, because if we don't understand that, we're not going to be able to see the through line from the decades prior to where we are now.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that Adar was with Associated Black Charities for a number of years and was influential and instrumental in developing a lot of the framework that we still use till today to, I think, identify expose anti-Blackness and to look at ways that institutions, organizations, policymakers can be more thoughtful and more insightful and more willing to have conversations about where they might be missing the mark. So I'm excited to have both Wayman and Adar here today. Let's dig right into the conversation. And if you're watching, please feel free to put some of your lived experience in the chat, ask your questions in the chat so that you can benefit from their expertise as well. When people talk about racial inequity in the workplace, anti-Blackness specifically in the workplace, we know all of the likely ways that people are willing to discuss, right? Like if my name is, Amira or Jamal, I might not get an interview, or there may be pay disparity, or there might be lack of opportunity for me to advance my career in the organization. Those are the things that people openly talk about. It's often, though, the more covert, smaller, not necessarily microaggressions, but aggressions that exist for Black people in the workplace that create the most trauma. Let's talk about some of those. What are some of those that you all would like to lift in this moment?
Can I lift one and connect it back to the work of ABC?
Absolutely.
The ABC for a number of years has run a board pipeline program. It was a program that was started when I was there. And for a number of years, I ran that program. But let me share with you how that program came to be, because it directly answers your question. That Black leaders are often overlooked in terms of mentorship. They are overlooked in terms of the opportunities and the access that their companies recommend them for, support them in pursuing, advocate for, right? And so in terms of the space of even Black and non-Black people of color becoming board members, there is a program in Baltimore that's a long existing program that trains that works with institutions and trains the employees that they recommend to become board members. A lot of Black and non-Black people of color were not being recommended to have that opportunity to go through that program. They were not being invested in. And that was where Associated Black Charities came in, seeing that there was a need there because Black leaders were not being asked, nor were they being invested in. And when I say invested in, Chrissy, I mean the institutions for which they work, with which they work, did not pay the cost of their being trained as board members, right? In a majority Black community. Where
serving Black people,
serving Black people. There you go. And so Associated Black Charities stepped up and met that need and have put through, I don't even know how many hundreds of individuals.
We're over 800.
There you go. You knew, I didn't know, you knew, over 800 who are now serving on boards because ABC saw that here was a concrete way in which anti-Blackness was showing up in the workplace. And they also assume responsibility for creating a program that opened doors. So doors that 800 leaders and managers who were being overlooked now had someone who saw them, saw their talent, who bore the responsibility, the financial and other responsibility of making sure that they had that same amount of training, right? Who also made sure that they had a working understanding of a DEI analysis and help them to make matches between those organizations serving Black communities in Baltimore City and Baltimore County, right? Who wanted to recruit Black and non-Black board members of color. They created a forum so that that need could meet that opportunity. And here you all are, 800 plus great board members later who probably would never have been able to have been recognized, trained, or placed that
Mhm.
early in their careers because they were not in institutions that thought that that was even a thing, even though they were making sure that their white employees, their white leaders had those opportunities. That's just one concrete example in terms of mentorship and in terms of people in leadership positions in institutions who are readily advocating for you as you make your way through the ranks.
Absolutely. And we just put in the chat the link to apply for our fall cohort of the Board Pipeline program. So if you're interested in that. Wayman, what are some other ways that are maybe a little less discussed, but ways that, you know, this impacts Black professionals in the workplace?
Well, first of all, I wanted to give a shout out and just echo what was said because I'm on two boards, Baltimore Clay Works board, and there are members that have gone through the Associated Black Charities pipeline, and the Baltimore Clay Works it is much needed because the board outside of that is very white, right, and it's in the middle of Baltimore. And then another example is GEDCO, Govas Ecumenical Development Corporation, that provides the lion's share of affordable senior housing in East Baltimore. And there was a board member that I brought on, and Amber, went through the board pipeline, and she's doing a great job. But what are some of the ways that that racism subtly manifests at work that's not really talked about? I'd say outside of the board end, it's the hiring and promotion piece. And I'll give a couple of concrete examples. So when I first joined Gilchrist, I noticed a similar pattern. And I noticed the pattern that I saw at Bayview, at Hopkins, at Mercy, while organizations can say, oh, our staff is diverse. When you look at it, the Black employees, especially Black men, were heavily overrepresented in either entry level or front level jobs. So um, at Bayview, for example, if you're an African American man, there are three jobs, right? There are security, culinary, and custodial. So those were the three. So, and I would often get stopped and asked, "Oh, are you security? Oh, are you the manager of the kitchen?" And it was just that prevalent. And it's not a knock against Bayview per se, but as an industry, I've worked in multiple hospital systems and healthcare systems, and that's what I saw. So CNAs, nurses aides are underrepresented, but they're underrepresented in higher level positions. And
Mhm.
in hospice, RN care managers. In hospice, the RN care manager, that's central to coordinating patient care. So before we even conducted our internal assessment at Gilchrist, I counted the Black RNs on two hands. And that's out of about 500 or 600 employees. Now, a lot of work has been done to change that recently, but the imbalance matters, especially considering hospice access. It remains lower. It's lower among African Americans, Black communities, Latino communities. So if we want to improve access and build trust, we need more Black RN care managers because the services really center around them. And then another barrier that I see, it's even how you frame and you post jobs. So is there an education requirement that might be essential for a certain job? Um, but maybe it's not, right? Maybe it's not essential for a job, but that requirement is still posted. And then at the same time, if you're not advertising at HBCUs, then you'll say, oh, well, we can't find diverse candidates for this. When
Mhm.
the outreach was never inclusive to begin with, the outreach was skipping over Black and Brown employees. And there was a number that I saw on CNBC, and it said that promotion. So once you're in, can you be promoted, right? But promotions have this bias as well. So 80%, up to 80% of jobs and promotions that are filled are through networking. It's through people that you know. So if leadership lacks diversity and promotes people within their own circles, then Black people can be left out. And that's a form of anti-Black racism. So it's important to really shore up show these pipelines, right? And there are ways to do that. There are ways that we've effectively done that at GBMC. So I see Bernard asking about what are some inclusive ways. So if it's exclusive, right, getting mentored, having this, being considered, being part of this pipeline, then you can make pipelines and training programs more widely accessible. You can advertise them. So what we do at GBMC, we have a clinical pipeline where if you're part of a clinical team, it's called the clinical ladder. You give a presentation, you advance in skills and training. We also have the core program, which is a leadership training program for staff, right? So clinical and non-clinical. So if you hear that, oh, well, we did not have a qualified candidate of color to be in this position, to be in this job, core allows people to get those skills. You're learning management, you're learning you're learning finances, you're learning budgeting, you're learning these things because it has to be opened up. Because if it's just kept, in an old boy network,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, then how can you advance, right? And then that hurts companies because there are great, talented people out there that are not even getting considered.
I want to get into some of the questions about this anti-racism at work, but I want to also center this, which is very important to me, which is the lack of psychological safety for Black people in these spaces. Oftentimes we can talk very, there's a willingness to talk about the things that we can quantify or qualify, right? Like lack of promotion and bias in hiring, or like the racial wealth gap and these things. But there's often a little bit more discomfort talking about the pure lack of psychological safety that Black people can face in these work environments where we literally can feel unsafe, where we are unsupported, where we're giving the roles and titles, but not the resources to do well or the authority to make decisions in those positions or roles. Or even worse, where we are singled out, isolated, or punished for speaking out unapologetically about broken systems and about racism in the workplace. I'd love to just stop and hear some of your thoughts about that. And then we'll go on to some of the questions about today's topic. I've found, even in my role currently, as I navigate spaces, leadership programs, cohorts, these places, that I'm often punished psychologically for my willingness to talk about oppression. How is that showing up post George Floyd for Black people in the workplace, and what are your insights?
So if I can backtrack and make one comment, because Wayman brought up something extremely interesting and I don't want to let the moment pass. And then I want to dive straight into the psychological safety. Can I do that?
Absolutely.
What you're sharing about Black people, and particularly Black men, just being in entry-level positions and people never getting moving up through the ladder as other groups do. Let me share, just to broaden it a bit and get kind of out of a DEI framework into an ARAO analysis. When we look at those industries where the majority of the workers are Black or are non-Black people of color, right? We find not only that, i.e., they are stuck on the bottom rung or a few rungs up on the ladder, they're stuck there. But we also find that those industries have crucial wage gaps. They pay less for comparable services than industries that do comparable things, but have a workforce that is whiter. And people never talk about that wage gap. And when they do, they want to go to, oh, it's because of education, it's because of training, it's because of this, it's because of that. But even when you factor in those things, you are still left with that racial wage gap, which is industry-wide, not only institution, but industry across the country. This is how another way in which anti-Blackness shows up. And so what we see in these types of moments is that it's not just about DEI, i.e. the statistical presence of people in a space. It's not just about that representation. It is about how institutions and society moves. And this leads us into your question, Chrissy, when you were talking about psychological safety or lack thereof, right? There is a thing called a Black tax. I know you all have heard of it. And it's not just the Black tax on the goods that we buy. That lack of psychological safety in a workplace and in other areas of society is part of the Black tax, because you are penalized as a Black person if you isolate racism from other isms in the workplace. You do not face that same type of punishment if you're talking about sexism. You do not face that same type of punishment if you are talking about issues of disability. There is a special type of punishment of removing that aura of belonging, that isolation, that career derailing, that in particular Black professionals face when they isolate the workplace ism of race. And that is very real. And no matter how detailed and equity statements, which I think is a bad idea, but that's another discussion, no matter how detailed those so-called equity statements or DEI statements, how sincere the commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression by institutional leaders who don't even know what that really means, when you get into the environment and you feel how your institution moves when certain things are discussed, when you are laid psychologically bare because you are pointing out the discrepancies, that is when you know that regardless of what an institution is saying or what is in their policy manual, that they are not institutions that practice ARAO and barely practice DEI. Because if they were institutions that practice those things, there would be a psychological safety in it. And one thing about this, post George Floyd moment, or even when we were in the George Floyd moment, institutions as society still had a difficult time talking about the expansiveness of racism and anti-Blackness, because what they wanted to do was class it. It only impacts poor Black people.
Poor Black people, that's right.
It only impacts the Black people who don't comply. It only impacts the Black people who are looking for trouble. It only impacts those people who live in certain communities. But the pervasiveness of racism and anti-Blackness in day-to-day life has always been the part of the conversation that Black people in particular in our workplaces would be punished for bringing up or even having honest discussion about.
Absolutely. And now we live in an age post executive orders where Black people in professional spaces are sitting and listening to open discussions about disability rights, about reproductive freedom, about LGBTQIA+ rights, about immigration, and all of these things, and still have to survive an unwillingness to discuss anti-Blackness.
Right. And this is why an ARAO, anti-racism, anti-oppression frame is so important, because none of what is happening now is new. None of it. And all of it has been built upon the history, the laws, the policies, the customs of anti-Blackness in U.S. society. So we, and when I say we, I mean the United States as a whole, but mostly I mean we white people. When I say we, I really mean white people, want to go back and say, this is not the America that I know. This is not the America that I grew up in. This is not the America that has been. When the reality is that, yes, this is always the America that has been. And if we are not willing to stare that fact straight in the face and to look at our own history around it, then we're not going to be able to dismantle anything because we're still lying to ourselves about what the United States has been. And I'm
And what
not
it was
saying
built
there
on.
haven't been positive things. That's not my conversation. My
Mhm.
conversation is that the United States of America, since its inception, has been a society that has built upon white supremacist ideology and practices. And until we are ready to look at that in an honest way and to see the expansiveness of it, to acknowledge that for the bulk of the history of this country, that is the way in which it has explicitly and legally operated, then we're not going to be able to look at anything at all because we're still more invested in the mythology and the lie and maintaining those things than we are in looking and speaking honestly and dismantling what needs to be dismantled so that everybody's talent has an opportunity to flourish.
Amen. Amen. So let's take it back to 2020. George Floyd murdered. There was global outrage, and many organizations put in place these DEI initiatives. They put these equity statements on the website. They formed these employee resource groups, which everyone knows I'm not the biggest fan of an employee resource group. All these
Amen,
things were put in place.
Chrissy.
Oh, good.
Amen.
Finally,
Yes,
a sister
yes.
in that, and we'll get to why, right? They put all these things in place. Companies invested in chief equity officers, DEI, chief of DEI, and all this. And here we are in 2025. And with the flick of a pen in January, executive orders were able to dismantle much of this, but also came the realization that Black people, Black women specifically, weren't necessarily the beneficiaries of this 5-year body of work. Talk to me about why it didn't work. What were the barriers to this working in the workplace?
Well, I wanted just to backtrack to the psychological safety issue. And where Black people are working in an office or a workspace where it's majority non-Black, there is sometimes an extra scrutiny, right? An extra pressure, an extra suspicion, an extra going over your work twice, disparate treatment, right? And this baseline level of a lack of safety can even impact somebody's willingness to address the racism that is happening in the office because you don't feel safe enough. So those conversations, they have to be normalized, and they have to be normalized not just by Black leaders, not just by Black staff, not just by the people that are champions of equity, but it really has to come from leadership, right? So the way that I would feel psychologically safe bringing it up is if the leader, the president, the CEO is right there alongside me championing that. And even when they do, there are still repercussions. There are subtle microaggressions. There are things under the surface that happen. There are cold shoulders. There are things that can occur. But all that impacts psychological safety.
Absolutely.
And can I say too, and the race of the leader does not matter.
Oh, yeah.
The race is DEI. Oh, we want to see ourselves. It has to be someone with an experience of oppression. Well, an experience of oppression does not equal an analysis of oppression. And as
that's all skin folk now. Skin folk. That's what you just said.
That's exactly
Right.
that's exactly what I'm saying.
That's right.
This is where, you know, we part of where we go wrong, part of why things don't work, because we assume that if we have racially integrated workplaces, i.e. representation in leadership, then all of a sudden the barriers will fall and there we will be. There needs to be people who have a strong anti-racism, anti-oppression analysis. And part of why none of these things worked, Chrissy, was because people and institutions did not have that analysis. That they moved toward the representation. And again, this is a a critical difference between DEI and ARAO. That DEI focuses on, okay, what cheeks are in the seats?
Mm-hmm.
That's what it focuses on. I'm going to have a Black person. I'm going to have a Native American person. I'm going to have a gay person. I'm going to have a person living with disabilities. It's like you're building your crayon box. That's why it doesn't work. But all of those people can still operate out of white supremacist
Yes.
ideology and practices. And that is why it didn't work, because this is where institutions, when they talk about inclusion, they also want to talk about fit. So they don't want a Chrissy and a Dar, a Wayman there. They want people who have
Will assimilate into the
out their
culture.
careers, right?
Yeah.
That they are willing to assimilate into the culture, and not only assimilate, but to maintain, to advance, to promote, to operationalize those cultures in support of a status quo. The reason that these initiatives did not work was because they were created not to work. They were created not to disrupt power dynamics, which is another difference between the 6 DEI frameworks and ARAO. ARAO is about power dynamics, societal as well as institutional. DEI is more about inclusion, bringing people in while not necessarily wanting to rock the boat of power dynamics and how institutions move. So why didn't these things work? Because they were created not to work. They were created
This is just performative.
Exactly.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. And when you look at organizations, and I just want to echo the importance of the analysis, because if you don't have an analysis or an assessment, you don't even know where you are in your anti-racism practices. And then organizations, when they are serious about a change or any initiative, you're going to see a KPI. You're going to see measurable, accountable, time-bound goals, right, that are embedded into the strategic plan. But if you don't address the power dynamic, if there are not champions of racial equity in the C-suite or on the board, you're going to have what you saw at Target, where they, profess all of this, wonderful stuff on their website, and even increase their Black supplier diversity, the supply chain. But then when the new administration came in, they rolled it back. And not only did they stop the diverse supply chain, they even went back and discontinued the Black vendors that came on board. So it's not as if they've stopped, but organizations even reverse. So you got to wonder who's in the C-suite, who's in the boardroom, right? Or who's not in the C-suite, who's not in the boardroom, who needed to be there for this to work so it can go beyond something performative to something of substance.
And I love the acknowledgement, which a lot of times people won't make in professional settings, but that's why I love this platform, that even when Black people are in the C-suite or on the boards, it still matters what their ideology is, what their value systems are, right? Like it's not enough just to have the face there. I love that. So we've talked about—
and can I say what their analysis is? Because ideology is very bad. Ideology is something that is set. It's like a stone that is set. It doesn't change. And one thing about an analysis is an analysis grows, and an analysis has to grow. It has to grow because there is always going to be pushback in direct proportion to the changes that are taking place. If you have an ideology, you will never be able to meet that. If you have an analysis, you will. One other thing that I would say is look at how quickly things were able to be rolled back, which lets you know how scratch deep their embedding was.
Their initiatives were,
but
right?
what the country and institutions were able to gear up with a moment's notice was what? It was white supremacist ideology. They lost no time in rolling back. There was no business as usual that was lost, right? And that shows you how deep that ideology, and it is an ideology, how deeply that still was embedded in our institutions and in our countries, regardless of the legislation. The 1964 Voting Rights Act, there was just a decision made that was another piece of dismantling, and it was around voting and people living with disabilities. It was about private citizens not having a right to sue because because voting rights access is lost for some citizens. So we have seen a rollback, a continued rollback of policies that were supposed to be so deeply embedded that it was supposed to protect historically marginalized individuals for generations. And yet we have seen a swiftness of the rollback, just like nobody except for maybe Black folk who've been saying that this was going to happen would have seen, right? But where we have not seen a rollback, where we have not seen a blip in doing business, was the reconstruction and the reoperationalization of white supremacist ideology in our institutions and in our legislatures, city, state, right, region, as well as federal. That's some deeply embedded stuff. So that tells you, if you ever have to ask the question, what is deeply embedded and what isn't, just look at what is happening now and you have your answer.
So I know with this work that we all do, the three of us do, we have to believe in a better tomorrow. We have to believe that there's a hope that dismantling can happen, that the breaking down of barriers can happen, and then some of this can happen in our lifetime. So I want to turn the page in a minute to be more solution oriented and to give our viewers some strategies to navigate this and perhaps to become better advocates. But first, I want to take just a minute and talk about these ERGs and these other intra-workplace initiatives that were put in place. I'm not a fan of the ERG. I do know of some that work well. I must say that. And people challenge me on that thought process, frequently. I don't believe that oppressed people should have the responsibility of bringing other people to consciousness. I personally don't believe it is the role of Black people who are already navigating all the isms and all the harms and all of the real life dangers to have to come in and teach people to respect them, to teach you about our culture, to teach you about what Juneteenth is. And I don't believe in that personally. But there are people who challenge me and we agree to disagree. What are your thoughts on placing the burden on marginalized people in workplaces to solve some of these systemic issues? And of course, the way I asked the question, I kind of led it to align with my beliefs.
I do have some comments about the employee resource group. And then I do understand if the employee resource group's goal is to dismantle the racist structures that have been put in place for generations, that's not an effective use of their time, and that can cause trauma, right? If it is to help develop a group that is creating a safe space and they want to normalize a conversation, but it has to be in tandem with real policy-driven, focused initiatives from leadership. And if leadership wants to come to an ERG and ask questions or ask insight, they can, but it shouldn't fall solely on the people who were oppressed, who are being oppressed, to change that oppression. We didn't create this. Why do we have to be the ones to fix it? Right?
Are there safe spaces at work, Wayman?
I'd say so. You have if you have your friend groups, your circles, but a perfect example, I do consider the Black Alliance Employee Resource Group at GBMC a safe space. And a lot of the work that we're doing is for ourselves. It's for our own development. It's for our own safety. And yes, if marketing wants to reach out to the Black community, they might come to us. Or I think we might sponsor maybe one event a year But a lot of the events, a lot of the education programming, it's coming out of the administration.
I've actually
Out of
come and
hospital
spoken
leadership.
with your group, so I know your group does good
Yeah.
work, but I still don't believe in it. But but I appreciate your vantage point. Adar, your thoughts, and then we'll move to some solution-oriented.
So many thoughts. But let me ask this question because I want a fuller understanding. For your group, Wayman, um, um, where is the power in terms of that group's continuation?
That's a very good point. And right now we are in
No,
transition.
where is the power? Where's the power? Does the group have the power of continuing, or if leadership said, okay, this group is no longer needed, would that group go away?
Oh, of course, the group would go away. We do have
Okay, wait,
a-
so let's stop there. I'm
yeah,
sorry, the group would go away.
I
And
believe so.
I raise that because the hidden driver in these types of conversations is who holds power.
Mhm.
And in these groups, they are existing by the benevolence and the covering of those who hold power, right? And it is the leadership of the organization. That constrains how any and all of these groups can move. When or if these groups make leadership uncomfortable, then those groups are gone. If they don't make leadership uncomfortable and they are serving a function and focus, especially in terms of the signaling aspect of, see, we're on board with these issues, then those groups get to stay and operate. So a difference between anti-racism, anti-oppression, even the questions we need to ask, which gets to your point, Chrissy, about moving this to more solutions oriented. If we don't have these honest, open conversations about the power component and about the spoken as well as unspoken parameters, then what are we really doing? And what we're really doing is that we are playing someone else's game. We are taking crumbs that we are offered and we are putting those to good use. Now, I'm not, and I want to be clear, I'm not putting forward a value judgment. I'm not. Because Black people in particular have done well with the crumbs that we have been given all through history. We've made something out of those crumbs. But one thing that we did was we had open conversations about power. That those discussions drove movements, whether they were societal movements or whether they were organizing within our institutions. We were clear. One thing that DEI does, those frameworks, is that they take the focus off of those honest conversations about power, and they accept the crumbs that they are given with no further strategy for moving anything forward or for pushing boundaries. In anti-racism, anti-oppression, the questions of power are foremost, as well as really doing that organizing needed around the internal structures, who's on board, the mapping, the power mapping. That is a very ARAO thing that is lost in other frameworks. And if we're talking about moving ahead and how to create more inclusive workplaces, even in these challenging climates, we have to have those types of organizing and power discussions, those types of honest discussions to be able to do so.
So I want to move on, and we're going to talk probably, hopefully, Wayman, a little bit about GBMC. You all do a really great job about being transparent, and you have your equity dashboard, which I actually go all across of Baltimore talking about, because it's one of the best case studies and examples I can give on really transparent reporting of equity efforts. But if we are to believe that things can get better, even in this climate, for Black professionals, then what are some strategies that as Black workers, as a workforce, we can strategize around to move our workplaces into more accountability? What are your thoughts? I'm just going to ask you to fire off a couple so that we can get through and then talk about just some functional ways people can become better advocates. What are some strategies?
Well, design and push for a key performance indicator, a test of change. So it's one thing to say, oh, well, let's change things, but how is it measurable? So identify how to make that measurable, and then educate the leadership. Is your leader on board? It shouldn't just be us as Black professionals, but how do we do the in reach to help people understand? So that's part of it, but also the mentoring, the pipelining. I remember before I was even in my current role, I would be at the leadership meetings and I would see folks bringing folks from their team into the leadership meeting to present, white people, right? And I'm not saying they're not qualified, but there's a lot of Black qualified people. So even people that weren't in a pipeline that had another position, but they were on the committee, I would still want to bring them in so that they can be at the table, get experience at the table, get exposed. So uh, Black people who have some form of leadership position, some form of
Authority.
voice, authority, can help bring people in. And
Mhm.
then the equity within these pipeline programs, when you expand it outside of just a closed door or an old boy system into something that is more equitable, that is a huge way to make an impact. And keep in mind, there are funders, there are donors, there are grants that are still looking at equity outcomes.
Adar, accountability. How do we push that forward?
I would say that every institution has to decide what type of institution it wants to be. Again, this is like where one of our first jump off the rails when we throw terms out there as if they are devoid of definitions and concepts. Not every institution is going to be an ARAO institution. Okay, not everybody is there yet. We're all aspiring to be there.
And for those who have joined on since we started, anti-racist, anti-oppressive.
And anti-racism, anti-oppression, ARAO. Some institutions are going to say, hey, we want to value more cultural competency. Some institutions are going to say, we don't want to do any of that at all. We just want to get the best candidate for the job. Some institutions are going to say that what they want is proximity. I mean, healing and reconciliation. Institutions really need to have an honest assessment as to where they are and where they feel they can go and be. Because if they don't have that, then none of anything else matters. It's all going to be performative because people are throwing stuff out there as if it has some meaning when it really doesn't. Right?
Adar, really quickly talk
And
about the 10 essential questions just as a tool to assess your
Thank you. So the 10 essential questions were documents that really give a roadmap for institutions who want to figure out where they are right now and where they might aspire to be. And we can have 10 essential questions of philanthropy, in terms of policy making, whatever. But just to give some concrete examples, one question might be, how are people from historically marginalized communities involved in your efforts in their community? And if the answer is, well, we come up with the ideas and then we come back to the community and say, here are 4 ideas, which one that you like best, you know that you're nowhere near ARAO or even DEI. If it may be a wake-up call for you that you need to increase conversations with those communities that you say that you are there to help. It may be that another question is that when you look at your board of directors, where are they in terms of an analysis. If you have a board of directors that is all corporate, and they're coming with that assimilative corporate experience, values, principles, understanding. And then you say that you're an ARAO institution. Oh, we need to do some reevaluation. So the even starting there in terms of using those different 10 essential questions as ways where you can evaluate where your organization is in terms of its operations, its policies, its practices, its processes.
Wayman? Yeah.
And I think that adding it to the strategic plan as well. So we had an assessment in, I believe, 2021. And then based off of that assessment, we put initiatives within a 3-year strategic plan. And then we would assess every year. And then after the end of that 3-year period, we did a whole other assessment. At this point, we were able to do it internally and then put forth the next indicators. But I just want to echo about leadership, about the board. And I think we have a test of change coming up. At GBMC, we have had Dr. John Cesar, who has been supportive of anti-racism practices. We have our Chief Diversity Officer, Lisa Walker, who has been the ultimate leader in this. But Dr. Cesar is retiring. So we're bringing in a new president of the healthcare system. So we're going to see, the practices that we've put together, how embedded they are with the new CEO coming in during this time of change. So it's almost a case study in accountability.
I'm going to run down some. Oh, go ahead, Adar. Yes.
If I could say one more thing. And so in terms of strategic plans, if there is a DEI section of your strategic plan, please know that no, just don't do that.
Don't do it.
That those principles should be built into every aspect of your work.
That's
they
right.
should not stand away from or be its own thing.
So I want to run down some ways that institutions can be a part of anti-racist transformation, because that's ultimately what we're asking for, what we want, and especially white people at those institutions. So if you're white and you're participating today, or you have access to white people, we need white people to relinquish power, right? To share decision-making, to amplify Black voices, and to do so without stealing credit. We need institutions and leaders who are willing to intervene in real time when there are harmful racist practices or exclusionary practices happening. We need immediate intervention. We need transparency so that honesty can build trust in these workplaces. And then we need to, in my opinion at least, stop asking marginalized people to teach and to bring you into consciousness, especially for free. Of course, we are suggesting that organizations consider the use of external partners who have the expertise to teach, to train, and to guide, and to challenge the institution to move toward accountability and progress. So I'm going to leave these couple of things, and I'm going to turn it over to the two of you for your kind of closing remarks today. You mentioned equity work is not isolated. It's baked into the organizational culture. We need institutions where Black staff feel safe naming racism and have a belief system that they'll be heard and protected. And we need to measure success not just by the intentions, but by the outcomes. And with that, I'd love for each of you, we'll go in the order we started, Wayman and then Adar, to just give some final thoughts on this conversation and maybe some suggestions for how people can become better advocates.
Well, it's important. It's important to continue to do this work, continue to drive it, continue to have those conversations. So I think if at the core you can normalize in your workspace having these conversations, that can create a psychological safety. And there's a big difference. There's a wide range of organizations. Some organizations might be doing just the basics, equal employment, opportunity law requirements, and there are some organizations that have their leaders embedded initiatives that are happening, hiring practices change, and both organizations have work to do, but the interventions are different. So assessing, right, getting an analysis, where are you along this scale can tell you a lot. But before you do that, even the normalization of having these conversations is going to be a big impact. And if you're Black and you're doing racial equity work, at work, you need to have a support network, a support system. This is physical, it's psychological, it's spiritual. It has an impact, and you need to take care of yourself as well.
Mm-hmm. Adar?
I would agree with Wayman on a lot of those things. And I love the questions that you asked, Chrissy. My caveat for the first question, amplify Black voices, be mindful of the Black voices or other voices that you amplify.
That's right.
That's right.
Just the
That's
first
right.
is just DEI. The second is strategic and analytical, and that is anti-racism, anti-oppression. The other thing is really thinking about what level of risk are you willing to assume? Because this is also about, as Chrissy noted, our psychological safety, but it is also about our careers. And particularly in Baltimore, which is a very small place, and people talk. And so you will gain a reputation. And if there are people who are upset with you because you upset a power balance, that is something that is going to follow you. So really think about, where are you at this point in your life, in your career, and what can you comfortably risk? And then agree, Wayman, in terms of having the community around you. I've been doing this type of work for almost 40 years now, and I am clear that I never would have been able to last without a learning community, a community that was invested in my growth, and a community that can help me see the blind spots in my analysis. And that continued growth is very important, because if we don't do this work internally, if we don't decolonize ourselves, we are not going to be very effective in the work that we do externally.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. We could talk about this for many more hours, and I feel like I want to revisit the conversation. So let's talk about how we can do that. And thank you all for joining today for Equity at Work. We will welcome you back in August, where our topic will be mental health advocacy for Black professionals. And so again, thank you for joining Associated Black Charities. I'm Chrissy Thornton. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.